Long before European ships appeared on the western horizon, America was already an ancient and inhabited world. For thousands of years, people had lived across its forests, deserts, grasslands, mountains, river valleys, islands, and frozen northern shores. They did not belong to a single culture. They did not speak one language, build the same kinds of homes, eat the same foods, or organize their communities in the same way. The continent was home to many different nations and societies, each shaped by its own history and by the land around it. In the far north, families lived beside cold seas and traveled across landscapes of snow, stone, and ice. Along the Pacific coast, communities depended on rivers and the ocean, where fish returned with the changing seasons. Across the plains, people followed animal migrations, gathered wild plants, and, in some regions, cultivated crops near permanent villages. In the Eastern Woodlands, large communities stood beside rivers and fertile fields. Farther south and west, people built homes from stone and earth, beneath towering cliffs and beneath the wide open sky. There was no single way to live in America before Columbus. Some communities moved during the year, following food and seasonal resources. Others remained in the same place for generations. Some settlements contained only a few families. Others grew into towns and ceremonial centers connected by roads, rivers, alliances, and trade. The land itself was not an untouched wilderness. People understood it, managed it, and changed it. They cleared fields, planted crops, guided the growth of useful plants, and used carefully controlled fires to renew parts of the landscape. They knew when fish would return to the rivers. They knew where deer traveled in winter. They understood which roots could be eaten, which plants could heal, and which materials could be shaped into tools, baskets, clothing, shelters, and boats. This knowledge was passed through families. Children learned by watching older relatives work. They listened to stories told beside fires. They followed adults into forests, fields, rivers, and workshops. A young person might learn how to recognize tracks in soft ground, how to prepare corn for cooking, how to shape a stone blade, or how to find the safest path through a winter storm. Daily life required patience and skill. A meal could depend upon months of preparation. Seeds had to be planted at the right time. Fishing nets had to be repaired. Meat and plants had to be dried before cold weather arrived. Wood had to be gathered. Roofs had to be maintained. Pottery had to survive the heat of a fire without breaking. Clothing had to protect the body from rain, wind, insects, heat, or snow. Nothing was simple merely because it was ancient. Behind every object was knowledge accumulated over generations. A woven basket might require carefully selected plants gathered during a particular season. A canoe might begin with the choice of a single tree. A stone tool might contain material carried or traded from hundreds of miles away. Communities were connected across great distances. Rivers served as natural roads. Footpaths crossed forests, deserts, and mountains. People exchanged food, shells, stone, copper, pottery, stories, and ideas. A person living far from the sea might possess a shell that had passed through many hands. A village without local copper might receive it through a chain of trade stretching across the continent. News traveled with visitors. Marriages connected families. Ceremonies brought neighboring communities together. Conflicts also occurred, as they have in every part of human history. But cooperation, diplomacy, and exchange were equally important parts of this world. The people living in America were not waiting to be discovered. They were raising children, building homes, growing food, creating art, negotiating alliances, honoring their ancestors, and preparing for the seasons ahead. They watched the movement of the sun. They followed the moon and stars. They marked the return of animals, the arrival of rain, the freezing of rivers, and the ripening of crops. Time was measured through nature, memory, ceremony, and work. As evening approached, smoke rose from settlements scattered across the continent. In one place, fish dried above a fire. In another, corn simmered inside a clay pot. Children carried water while adults completed the final tasks of the day. Tools were placed beside walls. Baskets were covered. Entrances and roof openings were secured against the night air. Beyond the circle of firelight, the landscape grew dark. Forests filled with the movement of nocturnal animals. Waves broke against distant shores. Wind passed through grasslands and desert canyons. Stars appeared above villages whose names would never be recorded by Europeans. This was America before Columbus. Not an empty land, not a silent wilderness, not a world without history. It was a continent filled with human voices, ancient knowledge, work, family, trade, ceremony, conflict, and memory. There was no single Native American way of life. There were many different worlds across the continent, and each one was shaped by its people, its history, and the land they called home. To understand how people lived across America before the arrival of Europeans, it is necessary to look first at the land itself. North America was not one environment. It was a continent of enormous distances and dramatic contrasts. In the far north, winter darkness could cover frozen coastlines for long periods. In the southwest, sunlight burned across dry plateaus, canyons, and desert valleys. Between them stretched forests, mountains, wetlands, river systems, open grasslands, and thousands of miles of coastline. Each landscape presented different challenges. Each also offered different possibilities. People did not simply survive in these environments. Over many generations, they developed detailed knowledge that allowed entire communities to live within them. In the Arctic, life was shaped by ice, wind, sea, and seasonal light. Wood was scarce in many northern regions, so people learned to use whatever materials were available. Driftwood could become part of a shelter or tool. Bone antler, stone, hide, and sinew were carefully shaped and reused. Warm clothing was essential. It had to protect the body while still allowing a person to move, hunt, work, and travel. Families depended on deep knowledge of animal behavior and changing sea ice. They watched for seals and other marine animals. They caught fish and gathered plants during the short, warmer season. Food collected at one time of year often had to last through months when little could be found. Northern life demanded planning. A damaged tool, a poorly prepared piece of clothing, or a missed hunting season could place an entire household in danger. But the Arctic was not viewed only as a hostile place. It was a homeland filled with familiar routes, meaningful places, and signs that experienced people knew how to read. Farther south, the Pacific coast offered a different world. Dense forests grew beside rivers and the ocean. Fish, shellfish, sea mammals, berries, roots, and forest animals provided many sources of food. In some regions, salmon returned to the rivers in great numbers. Their arrival could shape the rhythm of an entire season. People prepared fishing places, repaired equipment, and worked together to catch and preserve enough food for the months ahead. Wood was abundant and became one of the most important materials of daily life. It could be used to build large houses, storage containers, tools, canoes, and ceremonial objects. A single carefully chosen tree could be transformed through patient work. Large boats carried people along the coast and through inland waterways. The sea connected communities rather than separating them. Villages could exchange food, materials, news, and visitors by water. In the interior forests of the east, rivers also served as roads. The woodland environment provided deer, fish, birds, nuts, berries, roots, and medicinal plants. In many areas, people also cultivated crops. Communities created fields near their settlements and used the surrounding forests for hunting, gathering fuel, and construction materials. Life followed the seasons. Spring brought planting and the return of certain animals. Summer required work in gardens and fields. Autumn was a time of harvesting, hunting, drying food, and filling storage spaces. Winter brought different tasks. People repaired tools and clothing, prepared meals from stored supplies, visited relatives, and passed knowledge through stories and ceremony. The eastern forests were not endless, untouched wilderness. People used carefully controlled fire in many places to clear undergrowth, encourage useful plants, improve travel, and shape habitats for animals. The landscape that Europeans later encountered had already been influenced by generations of human decisions. Beyond the forests stretched the great grasslands of the interior. The plains were crossed by rivers, animal herds, and seasonal storms. Some communities combined farming with hunting. They established villages near water and fertile land, where they raised crops and stored food. During parts of the year, groups might travel beyond the village to hunt, before horses became widespread on the plains after European contact. Travel and hunting were organized differently from the familiar image of mounted riders. People moved on foot and used dogs to help carry belongings. Hunting large animals required cooperation, patience, and detailed knowledge of the land. Hunters studied tracks, wind direction, herd movement, and natural features that could help guide animals. A successful hunt provided far more than meat. Hide could become clothing, bedding, containers, or shelter coverings. Bone could be shaped into tools. Sinew could be used for sewing and binding. Fat could be prepared and stored. As little as possible was wasted. In the Southwest, water shaped nearly every decision. Rain could be unpredictable. Rivers and springs were precious. Communities learned how to farm in dry conditions by observing soil, slopes, rainfall, and seasonal water flow. Corn, beans, squash, and other crops were grown where conditions allowed. People built stone and earthen settlements that could remain occupied for generations. Some structures contained many rooms. Walls absorbed heat during the day and offered protection from temperature changes. Storage areas guarded crops against insects, moisture, and hunger. Homes were not placed randomly. Their location could reflect access to water, fields, building materials, defensive advantages, and long-standing traditions. In some regions, settlements were constructed beneath natural rock overhangs. In others, communities stood in open valleys or on high ground. People adapted architecture to local conditions while maintaining traditions that gave their communities identity. Across the continent, mountains created still more ways of life. High elevations brought cold winters and short growing seasons. Mountain valleys could provide shelter, water, plants, and routes through difficult terrain. People hunted animals, adapted to steep landscapes, and gathered plants at different elevations as the seasons changed. Knowledge of a mountain region meant knowing more than the location of a trail. It meant understanding when snow would block a pass, when roots were ready to gather, where animals moved, and where storms could arrive with little warning. Near great rivers such as the Mississippi and its tributaries, fertile soil supported large populations. Waterways carried people and goods across long distances. Villages and towns became connected to wide networks of exchange. Some settlements grew into major centers containing public spaces, ceremonial structures, workshops, and neighborhoods. The river provided food and transportation, but it also brought floods. People had to understand the changing water and decide where to build, plant, travel, and store supplies. No environment guaranteed an easy life. Abundance could disappear after a storm, drought, harsh winter, flood, or failed harvest. Every region demanded work and preparation, yet no region produced only one way of living. Two neighboring peoples could use similar resources differently. They might build different homes, speak unrelated languages, follow different political systems, and hold different beliefs about the world around them. Environment influenced culture, but it did not completely determine it. People made choices. They inherited traditions, adapted them, and passed new knowledge forward. Across North America, the shape of daily life depended upon a continuing relationship between community and place. A child born beside the Pacific coast learned a different landscape from a child raised near an eastern river. A family in the Arctic prepared for winter differently from a farming household in the Southwest. The foods cooking over their fires were different. The sounds outside their homes were different. Even the night sky could appear different depending on the season and latitude. But everywhere, people studied the world around them. They learned when to move and when to remain, when to plant when to harvest, when to hunt, when to repair a home, when to preserve food, and when to gather together before the difficult months ahead. As darkness settled across the continent, each landscape entered the night in its own way. Along the northern coast, cold wind moved over the ice. In the eastern forests, insects and frogs filled the darkness with sound. On the plains, grass shifted beneath a wide sky. In the southwest, stone walls slowly released the warmth they had absorbed during the day. Beside the Pacific, waves continued to break against the shore. Thousands of communities rested within these different worlds. Each belonged to a particular place. Each carried knowledge shaped by generations. And within those landscapes, people built lives that were not merely about survival, but about family, memory, work, and belonging. A home was one of the clearest signs of how deeply people understood the world around them. Across North America, houses were shaped by climate, available materials, family structure, movement, and tradition. There was no single Native American house. A home in the Arctic could look completely different from one in the eastern forests. A settlement on the plains followed a different rhythm from a stone village in the southwest. Yet every structure answered the same basic questions. How could a family stay warm? Where could food be stored? How could smoke escape? How much space was needed for sleeping, cooking, working, and gathering? What materials were available nearby? And how could a home survive the changing seasons? In the far north, building materials could be limited. Large trees did not grow everywhere, so communities used combinations of stone, earth, sawed driftwood, animal hide, and bone. Some winter homes were partly built into the ground. This helped protect the people inside from fierce wind and extreme cold. Earth surrounding the walls acted as insulation. A narrow entrance passage reduced the amount of cold air entering the living space. Inside, warmth came from bodies, lamps, carefully prepared fuel, and the shelter itself. Space was used efficiently. Sleeping platforms, storage areas, tools, clothing, and food all had to fit inside a protected interior. Nothing about these homes was accidental. Their design reflected generations of experience. Farther south, in the great forests of the East, wood and bark were widely available. Many communities built houses from flexible wooden frames covered with bark, woven mats, grass, or other plant materials. Some structures were rounded, others were long and rectangular. A small house might shelter one family. A longhouse could contain several related families living beneath the same roof. Inside, separate household areas could be arranged around shared fires. Smoke rose toward openings in the roof. Food tools, baskets, and clothing were kept along the walls or suspended above the ground. Sleeping places could be arranged on raised platforms. The building was not only a shelter, it was a place where several generations worked, ate, rested, and told stories together. The village surrounding it might include many similar structures, storage spaces, fields, paths, and gathering areas. Some settlements were protected by wooden walls. Others stood open beside rivers and farmland. Their size and arrangement depended on local needs, political conditions, and cultural traditions. In regions near the Mississippi and its tributaries, settlements could grow very large. Houses stood near public spaces, workshops, ceremonial areas, and immense earthen mounds. These mounds were built slowly through organized labor. People carried soil in baskets and added it layer by layer. Some mounds supported important buildings. Others held ceremonial or burial significance. The largest centers were not random collections of simple homes. They were organized communities with neighborhoods, open plazas, pathways, and spaces used for public gatherings. The placement of a home within such a settlement could reflect family ties, social position, work, and access to important areas. On the plains, some farming communities lived in permanent earth lodges. These were strong, substantial homes supported by heavy wooden posts. Branches and smaller timbers formed the roof. The structure was then covered with grass and earth. The thick outer layer helped protect the interior from heat, cold, and wind. A smoke opening in the roof allowed fires to burn inside. Beds and storage areas could be arranged around the walls. The center of the lodge remained important for cooking, warmth, and communal activity. Other groups moved more often and used portable shelters. These could be covered with animal hides and supported by long wooden poles. Their shape resisted strong wind and allowed smoke to rise through an opening above the fire. A portable home could be taken down, transported, and rebuilt. This was especially useful for communities whose lives required seasonal movement. But portability did not mean simplicity. The hides had to be prepared. The poles had to be selected. The covering had to be cut and fitted correctly. The entrance had to face in a practical direction. Every part of the shelter reflected skill. In the Southwest, homes could be made from stone, adobe, timber, and earth. Some settlements contained many rooms, joined together into large complexes. Walls were built thick enough to help control temperature. During the day, stone and earth absorbed heat. At night, they slowly released it. Small openings help protect the interior from cold wind and intense summer heat. Rooms could serve different purposes. Some were used for sleeping. Others held food, tools, pottery, or harvested crops. Roofs were made from wooden beams covered with branches, grass, and packed earth. Families sometimes entered rooms by ladders from above. In some places, the roof itself became an active part of daily life. People worked, dried food, repaired tools, and moved between connected rooms across the rooftops. Near some settlements stood circular or rectangular ceremonial spaces, often built partly underground. These were places for community gatherings, teaching, ritual, and shared memory. Homes and sacred spaces existed side by side. Daily life, family life, and spiritual life were often closely connected. In cliff regions, people built settlements beneath enormous natural overhangs. The rock above offered protection from rain, snow, and summer heat. Stone rooms filled the sheltered spaces. Ladders connected different levels. The settlement could seem to grow directly from the cliff itself. Yet even in these dramatic locations, daily life remained ordinary in many ways. People swept floors, children moved between rooms, corn was ground, water was carried, meals were prepared, sandals were repaired, pottery dried near walls warmed by the sun. On the northwest coast, abundant timber allowed communities to build large wooden houses. Massive posts supported wide roofs. Planks formed walls and floors. Several families could live together inside. Sleeping areas, storage spaces, fires, tools, and household objects were arranged within the broad interior. Some houses were carefully decorated. The building itself could express family identity, ancestry, status, and history. Near the shore stood canoes, drying racks, work areas, and storage facilities. The village faced the water because the water was one of its main roads. A person arriving by canoe would see the fronts of the houses from the sea. The settlement announced itself before the visitor stepped onto land. Across the continent, villages were shaped by movement. Paths connected homes to fields, rivers, forests, quarries, fishing places, and neighboring communities. Children learned these paths early. They knew which route led to water, which path reached the gardens, where wood was gathered, where animals were processed, where guests entered the settlement. A village was more than its buildings. It included the surrounding landscape and every place regularly used by the community. Inside the home, the day followed familiar patterns. Morning began with the fire. Ashes were stirred. Fuel was added. Food was prepared. Tools were gathered for the work ahead. During the day, people moved in and out. Some went to fields. Others hunted, fished, gathered plants, repaired roofs, shaped pottery, worked hides, carved wood, or cared for children. As evening approached, activity returned to the home. Food was brought inside. Tools were stored. Children settled near relatives. Smoke gathered beneath the roof before drifting through an opening. Shadows moved across walls of bark, hide, stone, wood, or earth. The sounds outside depended on the region. In a forest village, night carried insects, birds, and moving branches. Near a river, water could be heard beyond the houses. On the plains, wind pressed against the shelter. In the southwest, the temperature dropped quickly after sunset. In the Arctic, darkness and cold could surround the home for long hours. Yet inside, the fire created a small world of warmth and familiarity. People ate together. They repaired clothing and tools. They spoke about the day. Children listened to stories they might one day repeat to their own families. Older relatives carried memories of journeys, floods, hunts, harvests, conflicts, and ceremonies. The home protected more than the body. It protected knowledge. Every settlement had its own rhythm. Some woke before sunrise. Some remained active late into the night. Some were quiet during winter and crowded during seasonal gatherings. Some changed location over the year. Others remained connected to the same ground for centuries. What united them was not one style of architecture. It was the care with which people turned local materials into places of safety and belonging. Long before European houses appeared on the continent, North America was already filled with homes. homes of wood, homes of earth, homes of stone, homes of hide, homes beneath cliffs, beside rivers, along coasts, across grasslands, and near fields of corn. Each one reflected a community's history. Each one was adapted to a particular place, and each one became the center of daily life. Food shaped nearly every part of daily life. It influenced where people settled, when they traveled, how they organized work, and how they prepared for winter. A meal could begin months before it was eaten. Seeds had to be selected. Fields had to be cleared. Fishing places had to be prepared. Nets, baskets, traps, and tools had to be repaired. Meat and plants had to be dried, smoked, ground, or stored before they spoiled. Every season brought different work, and every region developed its own way of feeding a community. In many parts of North America, corn became one of the most important crops. It had spread northward over many generations through migration, exchange, and cultivation. Different communities developed varieties suited to their own climate. Some matured quickly during short growing seasons. Others were better adapted to hotter and drier land. Corn was not simply planted and forgotten. People watched the soil, rainfall, temperature, insects, and the changing seasons. Fields had to be maintained. Young plants had to survive drought, storms, and animals. A strong harvest could support a village through difficult months. A failed harvest could bring hunger. Corn was often grown together with beans and squash. The corn stalks gave the beans something to climb. The beans helped restore nutrients to the soil. The broad squash leaves shaded the ground, reduced weeds, and helped hold moisture. Together, these crops provided a dependable source of food, but not every community farmed in the same way. In the Eastern Woodlands, fields could be established near rivers and villages. In the Southwest, farmers studied runoff, slopes, soil, and seasonal water flow. Some built small channels or terraces. Others planted where rainwater naturally collected. In dry regions, people watched the sky with great care. A storm could save a crop. It could also wash away soil or arrive too late. Farmers learned which seeds tolerated cold, which plants survived dry conditions, which fields warmed first in spring, which low areas held too much water, which plots needed rest, and which crops could be stored for the longest time. Harvest brought intense activity. Ears of corn were gathered and carried home. Some were eaten fresh, others were dried. Kernels were removed and stored in baskets, clay vessels, pits, or specially prepared rooms. Later, the corn could be ground into meal, boiled into porridge, added to soups, or prepared in other ways. Grinding was repetitive and demanding work. The sound of stone moving against stone could fill a home in the morning. Beans were dried. Squash was cut and preserved. Seeds were set aside for the next planting season. Not everything could be eaten immediately. Storage was essential. Food had to be protected from moisture, insects, rodents, mold, and theft. Some communities used raised storage structures. Others sealed supplies inside pottery containers. In the Southwest, dry rooms within stone settlements could hold corn for long periods. In colder regions, Low temperatures made other forms of storage possible. Each method reflected local conditions and long experience. Farming was only one part of the food system. In the eastern forests, people gathered nuts, berries, roots, greens, fruits, seeds, and mushrooms. Some plants were eaten fresh. Others were dried, roasted, ground, or mixed into soups. Knowledge of wild plants was essential. Some were safe only after careful preparation. Others could be used as medicine. Some were poisonous and had to be recognized immediately. Children learned these differences by following experienced gatherers. They learned where certain plants grew, when they were ready, how to collect them, and how to avoid damaging the place where they would return the following year. Hunting also required years of training. A hunter needed more than a weapon. Tracks had to be interpreted. Wind direction mattered. Broken branches, droppings, calls, and disturbed ground all carried information. Hunters learned where deer fed, where birds gathered, when herds moved across open land. They understood the difference between fresh and old tracks. They knew how weather changed animal behavior. A successful hunt could involve long hours of patience and only a few moments of action. Large animals provided far more than meat. Hide became clothing, bedding, containers, or shelter coverings. Bone could be shaped into needles, scrapers, hooks, and other tools. Sinew became thread or binding. Antler could be used for handles and points. Fat could be prepared and stored. Very little was wasted. Small game mattered too. Rabbits, birds, turtles, and other animals could be caught with traps, nets, clubs, or bows. Young people often learned hunting skills with smaller animals before joining more difficult hunts. Fishing sustained countless communities. Along rivers, lakes, and coasts, people used hooks, spears, traps, nets, weirs, and baskets. Some fishing structures guided fish into narrow spaces where they could be collected. Others were placed where seasonal runs were predictable. Along the Pacific coast, salmon could return in enormous numbers. Their arrival shaped the work of entire villages. Fish had to be caught quickly, then cleaned, cut, dried, and smoked before they spoiled. Drying racks filled the settlement. Smoke drifted through the air. The work could continue for days. A successful season could provide food for many months. Along other coasts, people gathered shellfish, hunted sea mammals, caught smaller fish, and collected sea plants. The ocean provided abundance, but it also demanded knowledge. Tides changed, storms arrived, currents could turn dangerous, boats had to be built and maintained. Fishing grounds had to be remembered. The right season mattered. On the plains, hunting large herds required cooperation. Before horses became widespread after European contact, hunters moved on foot. They studied the landscape and used rivers, hills, valleys, and natural barriers to help guide animals. A successful hunt depended on timing, discipline, and group effort. Afterward, the work continued. Meat had to be cut, hides had to be cleaned and stretched, bones, sinew, fat, and organs had to be sorted and prepared. Nothing happened quickly. Food was not separated from labor. Every meal carried the memory of planting, gathering, hunting, fishing, drying, grinding, carrying, and storing. Cooking methods also varied. Food could be roasted over fire, boiled in clay pots, baked in earth ovens, smoked above low flames, or heated with stones placed into containers. In places without suitable pottery, hot stones could be dropped into tightly woven baskets or skin containers to heat water and cook food. Corn, beans, meat, roots, and herbs could be combined into thick soups and stews. Fish could be roasted fresh or preserved for later. Seeds and nuts could be ground into paste or meal. Different communities developed their own flavors, techniques, and traditions. Meals were practical, but they were also social. Families ate together. Food was shared with guests. Ceremonies and gatherings required preparation beyond the needs of one household. A large event might bring visitors from neighboring communities. More corn had to be ground. More wood had to be gathered. More pots had to be filled. Food could express generosity, alliance, respect, and responsibility. A household that had more might help one that had suffered a failed hunt or poor harvest. Sharing was not simply kindness. In many places, it was part of how a community remained strong. Hunger was always possible. A drought could damage crops. A flood could destroy fields. Fish might fail to return in expected numbers. A severe winter could last longer than stored supplies. Animals might change their routes. Insects could ruin food. Illness could prevent people from working. Survival depended on preparation, cooperation, and knowledge. This is why food storage, seasonal planning, and social relationships mattered so deeply. As evening approached, the work of gathering and preparing food slowed. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Clay pots rested near the heat. Fish or meat hung above low flames. Corn was ground for the next meal. Children carried water. Adults sorted tools and covered stored supplies. The smell of food spread through houses of bark, wood, stone, earth, and hide. Some families ate fresh fish beside a river. Others shared a thick corn soup. On the coast, dried salmon might be brought down from storage. On the plains, preserved meat could be mixed with fat and berries. In the Southwest, beans and corn simmered slowly as the stone walls released the heat of the day. Food connected people to the land around them. It connected one season to the next. It connected children to the knowledge of their elders. And it connected each household to the wider community on which survival often depended. Near the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, not far from the place where St. Louis stands today, there was once a city unlike anything many people now imagine when they think about ancient North America. Today, the place is known as Cahokia. At its height, centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, Cahokia was the largest known urban center north of Mexico. It contained neighborhoods, public plazas, ceremonial spaces, workshops, fields, and enormous earthen mounds built by human hands. The largest of these mounds still rises above the surrounding land. It was created gradually, basket by basket, as people carried and placed enormous quantities of soil. Building such a structure required planning, labor, organization, and cooperation on a scale far beyond a small village. Cahokia did not appear suddenly from empty land. It grew within a region already connected by rivers, farming communities, trade routes, and long established traditions. The Mississippi and its tributaries carried people, food, raw materials, and information across great distances. The river was not simply part of the landscape. It was one of the city's main roads. Canoes arrived from nearby settlements and from places farther away. Visitors entered a busy world. They would have seen houses spread across the surrounding area. Smoke rose from cooking fires. People moved between homes, fields, workspaces, and gathering places. Corn grew in nearby farmland. Food was carried into the settlement. Pottery, stone tools, woven goods, ornaments, and other objects changed hands. Children played near houses while adults worked. The city was alive with movement. At the center stood broad open spaces used for gatherings, ceremonies, exchange, and public life. Large mounds rose around these plazas. Some supported important buildings. Others served ceremonial or burial purposes. Their shape and position reflected decisions made by leaders, builders, families, and communities over many years. The city had order. Its important spaces were arranged according to shared ideas about power, ceremony, direction, and belonging. This was not an accidental settlement. It was a planned center. The people who lived there belonged to what historians now call the Mississippian world. That modern term covers many communities spread across a wide region. They were connected by certain forms of architecture, agriculture, trade, and ceremonial life, but they were not all identical. Different towns had their own leaders, traditions, alliances, and rivalries. Cahokia became one of the most influential centers within this wider world. Its power did not rest on one thing alone. The surrounding land was fertile. The river created movement and exchange. Agriculture supported a large population. Ceremonies attracted visitors. Leaders organized labor. Specialists produced goods. Families maintained fields, homes, and local networks. The city depended on all of them. Daily life there would have been demanding. A large population needed food every day. Fields had to be planted, weeded, watched, and harvested. Corn had to be dried, stored, and ground. Water had to be carried. Firewood had to be collected. Houses needed repair. Roofs needed new thatch. Clay had to be gathered for pottery. Stone had to be shaped into tools. Mats, baskets, clothing, and containers had to be made and maintained. A city could not survive on ceremony alone. It rested on endless ordinary work. Some people likely spent much of their time farming. Others may have been skilled in pottery, stonework, woodworking, or the production of ceremonial objects. Some organized trade. Some helped build and maintain public structures. Some prepared food for large gatherings. Some carried messages. Some cared for children, elders, or the sick. The work of women, men, children, and older people all contributed to the life of the city. Archaeologists have found materials Cahokia that came from distant regions. Copper, marine shell, special stone, and other valuable materials reached the city through long trade networks. These objects reveal a world of movement. A shell from the coast could travel inland through many exchanges. Copper from the Great Lakes region could be worked far from the place where it was found. Stone suitable for tools or ceremonial objects could pass from one community to another. The city stood within a continent already connected. Trade carried more than objects. It carried stories, styles, beliefs, marriage ties, political messages, and news. A visitor arriving in Cahokia might bring information about a distant harvest, a conflict, a death, a ceremony, or the movement of another group. The city absorbed these connections and sent its own influence outward. At certain times, Cahokia may have held large public ceremonies. People gathered in plazas. Food was prepared in great quantities. Visitors arrived from surrounding settlements. The sound of voices, movement, music, and ritual filled the central spaces. Such events strengthened relationships and reminded people that they belonged to something larger than a single household. They also displayed authority. The ability to bring together large numbers of people, organize labor, and distribute food was a form of power. Yet the city was not permanently stable. Large communities face pressures. More people require more wood, more food, more space, and more organization. Floods, drought, conflict, disease, political rivalry, or changing trade networks can weaken even a powerful center. Over time, Cahokia declined. Its population decreased. Some areas were abandoned. People moved elsewhere. The exact reasons remain debated, and no single explanation can fully account for the change. What is clear is that the city's decline was not the disappearance of its people. Communities continued across the region. Traditions changed, moved, and survived. The descendants of Mississippian peoples did not vanish when Cahokia became quieter. Later European observers often misunderstood the great earthworks they encountered. Some refused to believe that the ancestors of native peoples had built them. This false idea helped create the myth of a lost and mysterious race of mound builders. But the mounds were not the work of an unknown, vanished people. They were created by indigenous societies whose descendants remained in North America. The real story is more interesting than the myth. A major city had flourished in the Mississippi Valley before European colonization. Its people farmed, traded, built monuments, organized public life, and created a center whose influence reached far beyond its boundaries. As evening fell over Cahokia, the city would not have become silent all at once. Workers returned from fields. Cooking fires brightened. Food was carried into houses. Children settled near relatives. Dogs moved between structures. Smoke drifted over rooftops. Voices crossed the open spaces. Beyond the central plaza, the great mound stood dark against the sky. The river continued moving nearby. Canoes were pulled onto the shore or secured for the night. Stored corn was checked. Tools were placed inside. Entrances were covered. Some fires burned low. Others remained bright where families or visitors continued speaking. From the top of a great mound, a person might have looked across a wide settlement filled with scattered points of fire. Beyond them lay fields, smaller communities, forests, wetlands, and the river routes connecting Cahokia to the wider continent. This was not a lonely village at the edge of history. It was a city, a center of work, authority, ceremony, trade, and family life. And centuries before Europeans arrived, thousands of people already called it home. Cahokia was only one part of a much larger world. Across North America, communities were connected by routes that crossed rivers, forests, mountains, deserts, and coastlines. These networks existed long before European ships reached the continent. They were not drawn on paper maps, but they were remembered, traveled, and passed from one generation to the next. Some routes followed waterways. Others followed ridges, valleys, coastlines, or familiar passages through difficult country. A traveler might move by canoe for part of the journey, continue on foot, and then join another group heading toward a distant settlement. Travel could take days, weeks, or longer. The land between communities was not empty. It contained hunting grounds, camps, sacred places, known water sources, difficult crossings, and territories belonging to other peoples. To travel safely required knowledge. A person needed to know where to stop, which river crossing was dangerous after rain, where winter snow remained longest, which paths were used by friendly communities, and where permission might be needed before continuing. Trade was built on relationships. People did not simply arrive, exchange objects, and leave. Visitors might be welcomed into homes. They could share food, carry messages, take part in ceremonies, or renew old agreements. A trading partner could also be a relative, an ally, or a person connected through marriage. Trust mattered. A journey through unfamiliar territory was safer when others recognized the traveler and understood why they had come. Some exchanges happened between neighboring settlements. Others carried materials across astonishing distances. Marine shells from the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico traveled far inland. Copper from the Great Lakes region appeared hundreds of miles away. Obsidian and other volcanic stone moved from western sources into distant communities. High-quality flint and chert were carried far beyond the places where they were quarried. Animal hides, feathers, pigments, salt, dried food, pottery, baskets, and carefully made tools also moved between peoples. A small object could contain a long history. A shell ornament found far from the sea may have passed through many hands. It may have been carried along a river, exchanged at a seasonal gathering, taken into another region, and finally given as a gift or worn during a ceremony. By the time it reached its final owner, it was more than a piece of shell. It carried the memory of distant places and relationships. Copper was another valued material. It could be shaped by hammering and careful working. It became ornaments, tools, and ceremonial objects. Its shine and rarity gave it importance in many communities. But copper did not move by itself. People carried it. They knew where it came from. They knew who had access to it. They understood the obligations created by receiving something valuable. Trade connected households and leaders. It also connected ordinary workers. A potter might copy a design seen on a vessel from another region. A toolmaker might learn a new method from a visitor. A family might begin growing a crop brought through exchange. A child might hear a story about a distant river or a city never seen before. Ideas traveled alongside materials. Styles changed. Techniques spread. Stories were retold in new languages. Even food could reveal distant connections. Corn itself had moved northward over generations. Different varieties were adapted to local climates and soils. Beans, squash, tobacco, and other cultivated plants also traveled through human networks. Seeds were precious. They were carried carefully and shared selectively. A handful of seeds could alter the future of a community. If they grew well, they might be planted again the following year. Over time, they could become part of local food, ceremony, and identity. Trade gatherings could bring together large numbers of people. Some occurred at major settlements. Others took place seasonally when travel conditions were favorable and food was available. People arrived carrying bundles, baskets, tools, ornaments, skins, dried meat, seeds, and news. The gathering might last several days. There were negotiations, visits, ceremonies, games, feasts, and private conversations. Old relationships were renewed, new ones were created. Marriages might be arranged. Disputes might be discussed. Messages could be sent home with returning travelers. The exchange of goods was only one part of the event. Such meetings helped hold the wider world together. They allowed people to learn what was happening beyond their own region. A poor harvest in one place might be balanced by abundance somewhere else. A conflict could close one route and strengthen another. The rise of a powerful town could redirect trade. A flood could force travelers onto unfamiliar paths. These networks changed over time because the people using them made decisions. Some communities became important centers because they stood near major rivers or crossroads. Others controlled access to rare materials. A settlement near salt deposits could trade something every household needed. A community beside a rich fishing ground might preserve large quantities of food. A place known for skilled pottery, stonework, weaving, or boat building could attract visitors from far away. Specialization created interdependence. Not every community had to produce everything. People could exchange what they had in abundance for what was difficult to obtain locally. But trade could also create tension. Valuable roots and resources could become sources of rivalry. Communities might compete for access to quarries, river crossings, hunting territories, or fertile ground. Travelers had to understand political relationships. A gift could create peace. An insult could create danger. An agreement between leaders could open a route. A conflict could close it. Diplomacy was therefore essential. People carried not only goods, but also words chosen carefully. Messages could confirm an alliance, request assistance, announce a ceremony, warn of danger, or propose peace. Some travelers became skilled at moving between different cultural worlds. They may have spoken more than one language or relied on interpreters. They understood local customs. They knew how to approach a settlement respectfully. They recognized signs of welcome and signs of caution. Such knowledge could be as valuable as the objects they carried. The diversity of North America made these connections especially important. A person from a coastal community might meet someone from the interior whose clothing, food, language, and housing were unfamiliar. Yet both could understand the value of exchange. The meeting did not erase their differences. It created a bridge between them. Over time, distant regions influenced one another without becoming the same. A design could spread while its meaning changed. A ceremonial object could be adopted into a new tradition. A crop could become essential in a place where it had once been unknown. People chose what to accept, what to modify, and what to reject. Trade was never simply the movement of objects. It was a conversation between communities. The river systems of the continent played a central role in this movement. The Mississippi and its tributaries connected the interior across an enormous distance. The Missouri, Ohio, Arkansas, Tennessee, and many smaller rivers created a web of travel. Canoes could carry more weight than a person traveling on foot. They allowed families and traders to move food, pottery, stone, wood, and other goods. But river travel required skill. Currents changed with the season. Floods covered familiar banks. Fallen trees created hazards. Shallow water could force travelers to carry their canoes over land. Storms could turn calm water dangerous. Experienced travelers read the river as carefully as hunters read tracks. In the Southwest, routes often depended on springs, streams, and reliable water holes. A traveler crossing dry country had to know exactly where the next water could be found. Distances were measured not only in miles, but in the time between safe resting places. Goods had to be light enough to carry. Travel during extreme heat could be dangerous. Some journeys were made at cooler times of day. The landscape demanded discipline. Along the Pacific coast, large canoes connected villages by sea and river. Travelers moved between islands, bays, and estuaries. Coastal navigation required knowledge of tides, currents, winds, reefs, and weather. A route that appeared open could become dangerous when conditions changed. The ocean offered speed and access, but it required respect. In the Arctic, exchange linked communities across long distances, despite the cold. Materials such as stone, metal from natural sources, animal products, and crafted goods moved through northern networks. Travel could follow sea ice, coastlines, and seasonal routes. A journey might depend on weather and ice conditions that changed rapidly. People who understood those conditions could move through a landscape that appeared impossible to outsiders. Wherever trade occurred, objects gained meaning through human relationships. A gift given during a marriage carried different meaning from an object exchanged for food. A ceremonial item might symbolize authority or spiritual importance. A tool could represent practical cooperation. A rare material might show that its owner had strong connections beyond the local community. Possession told a story. It revealed where a person had traveled, whom they knew, and what obligations connected them to others. As evening fell at a trading place, the activity did not end immediately. Visitors gathered near fires, bundles were opened and examined, food was shared, people compared tools, ornaments, and materials. Messages were delivered, stories of distant places passed through the camp. A traveler might describe a great river, a dry season, a successful harvest, or a settlement larger than any the listeners had seen. Children watched unfamiliar visitors and heard languages different from their own. Adults renewed old friendships or discussed the next journey. Beyond the firelight, canoes rested along the shore. Packed goods waited for morning. Some would continue east. Others would travel north, south, or west. Each object would move farther into the continent. Each traveler would carry new knowledge home. Long before European merchants arrived, North America already contained vast systems of movement and exchange. Its peoples were not isolated from one another. They lived within a connected world shaped by travel, diplomacy, trade, memory, and trust. Daily life depended not only on the land, food, and trade, but on the people within each household. Families were the center of work, learning, memory, and belonging. A child entered a world already shaped by relatives, responsibilities, and expectations. From the earliest years, children learned by watching. They followed adults through the routines of the day. They saw how a fire was prepared, how food was stored, how tools were handled, how clothing was repaired, how water was carried, how guests were welcomed, how people spoke to elders, and how work was shared. Learning was not separated from life. A child did not need a formal classroom to begin understanding the world. The home, field, forest, river, workshop, and gathering place all became places of instruction. Older relatives explained some things directly. Other knowledge came through repetition. A child might spend years watching someone shape stone before being trusted with the same task. A young person learning to hunt first had to understand tracks, wind, silence, and animal behavior. Someone learning to prepare food had to recognize which plants were ready, how long they could be stored, and what methods made them safe to eat. Mistakes could be costly, so patience mattered. Skill was built slowly. Children also learned through stories. Some stories explained the origins of a people or a place. Others taught behavior. They showed what happened when someone acted selfishly, ignored advice, broke a promise, or failed to respect the natural world. Stories could be entertaining, but they also carried law, history, memory, and identity. A child hearing the same story many times learned more than its plot. They learned when it should be told, who was allowed to tell it, what details mattered, and how it connected the present to earlier generations. Family structure differed from one society to another. In some communities, identity and inheritance followed the mother's line. In others, the father's line held greater importance. Some households were small. Others included grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and several generations living close together. Marriage could connect more than two individuals. It could strengthen ties between families, villages, or political groups, a marriage might create new obligations. It could open trade relationships, reduce conflict, or bring someone into a different community. The exact meaning of family depended on local tradition. But nearly everywhere, survival required cooperation. One person could not do everything alone. Fields had to be planted and harvested. Children had to be watched. Food had to be prepared. Homes had to be repaired. The sick and elderly needed care. Hunting, fishing, gathering, pottery, weaving, woodworking, and toolmaking all demanded time. Work was often divided by age, skill, gender, status, and season. But the details were different in every culture. There was no single rule for all native societies. Some tasks were strongly associated with women, others with men. Some were shared. Some changed during emergencies or seasonal work. A person's responsibilities could also shift over a lifetime. Children carried small loads, gathered fuel, frightened birds from fields, helped prepare food, watched younger siblings, and learned simple crafts. As they grew, their work became more demanding. Adults handled the heaviest responsibilities. Older people often carried knowledge that younger generations needed. Age could reduce physical strength, but it could increase authority. An elder might remember old boundaries, family histories, dangerous winters, past conflicts, medicinal plants, ceremonial rules, or routes that others had forgotten. This knowledge could guide an entire community. Care for children was not always limited to their parents. Grandparents, older siblings, aunts, uncles, and other relatives could all take part. A child belonged to a wider network. That network offered protection, but it also created responsibilities. Young people were expected to learn how to contribute. Growing up meant becoming useful to others. The work of maintaining a household never truly stopped. Before sunrise, someone might stir the ashes and rebuild the fire. Water had to be brought. Food had to be prepared. Stored supplies had to be checked. If it was planting season, people moved toward the fields. If fish were running, the village might gather near the river. If winter was approaching, more time was spent drying food, repairing shelters, and preparing clothing. Every season changed the balance of work. During harvest, many hands were needed at once. During a large hunt, people who did not hunt still had essential tasks afterward. Meat had to be cut and preserved. Hides had to be cleaned. Tools had to be repaired. Food had to be distributed. A successful event could create days of work. Craftsmanship was part of household life. A basket began with gathering the correct plants. The fibers had to be prepared, softened, split, dyed, and woven. A clay vessel began with finding suitable clay. It had to be cleaned, shaped, dried, decorated, and fired without cracking. A hide had to be scraped, stretched, softened, smoked, and cut before becoming clothing. A wooden bowl or tool required selecting the right piece of wood. A stone point could break after hours of careful work. None of these objects appeared quickly. The more skilled the maker, the easier the work might look. But behind that ease were years of practice. People were known for what they could do well. A gifted potter, healer, hunter, carver, speaker, farmer, boat builder, or diplomat held value within the community. Skill created respect. It could also create obligations. A person with rare knowledge might be asked to help many households. Some forms of work were individual. Others required the entire community. Building a large house, raising a wooden wall, constructing a mound, clearing a field, or preparing for a major ceremony demanded coordinated labor. People worked beside relatives and neighbors. Food might be provided for everyone involved. Songs, conversation, and shared effort helped carry the work forward. Community labor strengthened relationships. It also revealed tensions. People remembered who contributed and who did not. Disagreements were part of life. Families argued. Leaders competed. Neighbors disputed land, marriage, resources, or responsibility. Communities were not peaceful simply because they lived close to nature. They contained the same human emotions found everywhere: love, jealousy, loyalty, ambition, fear, generosity, grief. Conflict could occur within a household, between families, or between settlements. But people also had ways to manage it. Relatives might intervene. Elders could offer judgment. Gifts could repair relationships. Public discussion might settle a dispute. In some societies, councils made important decisions. In others, leaders held greater authority. Political life differed widely. Leadership itself took many forms. A leader might be respected because of family position, generosity, military success, ceremonial knowledge, speaking ability, or skill in building alliances. Power was not always absolute. A leader who failed to persuade others might struggle to act. In many communities, authority depended on maintaining trust. Food distribution, diplomacy, and public generosity could matter as much as force. Women held important economic, social, political, and ceremonial roles in many native societies. In some communities, women controlled fields, food stores, homes, or family property. In others, they helped choose leaders or influence decisions through clan relationships. Their authority cannot be reduced to one pattern. The same is true for men. Roles varied across cultures and changed over time. What mattered was that daily life depended on many forms of labor, not only the most visible ones. The person grinding corn, preserving fish, sewing clothing, watching children, gathering medicine, or maintaining a roof could be as essential to survival as the person returning from a hunt. Illness and injury brought the household together in a different way. People used plant knowledge, massage, heat, rest, ceremony, and other methods of healing. Some individuals became known for their knowledge of medicine. They understood where particular plants grew, how they should be prepared, and when they were dangerous. Healing could involve both physical and spiritual ideas. The two were not always separated. A sick person might receive herbs, special food, prayer song, or ritual care. Not every illness could be cured. Childbirth, infection, accidents, hunger, and severe weather all brought real danger. Death was familiar. Communities developed traditions for mourning, burial, and remembrance. The dead remain part of family memory, their names actions, and relationships could continue to shape the living. Even during grief, daily work had to continue. Children still needed food, fires still needed fuel, crops still needed attention. The ability of a household to continue depended on support from others. This is why family and community ties were not merely emotional. They were practical systems of survival. A person knew who might help after an injury, who could share food during a poor harvest, who would care for a child after a death, who would speak on behalf of the family during a dispute. Belonging created security. It also created duty. As the day ended, families returned to their homes. The work outside slowed. Tools were cleaned and stored. Children settled near older relatives. Food was divided. Someone repaired a torn garment or unfinished basket beside the fire. Someone else told a story already known by everyone in the room. A child listened. Even if the words had been heard many times before, outside, the village darkened. Inside, knowledge continued to pass from one generation to the next. This was how a community survived, not only through hunting, farming, or trade, but through the daily act of teaching people how to belong to one another. Across North America, people understood the world through traditions that connected daily life with land, ancestors, animals, seasons, and forces that could not always be seen. These beliefs were not the same everywhere. There was no single native religion. Each nation had its own ceremonies, stories, sacred places, responsibilities, and ways of understanding life. Some traditions were shared publicly. Others belonged only to certain families, societies, healers, leaders, or ceremonial specialists. Some knowledge was taught openly. Other knowledge was protected. To understand these communities, it is important not to reduce their beliefs to a few symbols or simple ideas. Spiritual life was often woven into ordinary work. Planting could carry ceremonial meaning. A hunt could involve respect, preparation, and gratitude. Water, fire, animals, mountains, rivers, and particular places could hold significance far beyond their practical use. A landscape was not only a source of food and materials, it could also contain history, memory, and obligation. People knew where important events had taken place. They remembered where ancestors had traveled. They knew which places required caution, respect, or special behavior. A hill, spring, cave, grove, river bend, or rock formation could carry a story older than any living person. These stories helped explain why a community belonged to a place and how people were expected to live within it. Ceremonies marked important moments. They could accompany planting, harvest, hunting seasons, healing, marriage, mourning, leadership, or the movement from childhood into adulthood. Some lasted only a short time. Others brought together many people over several days. Visitors arrived. Food was prepared. Songs were repeated in the correct order. Clothing and ceremonial objects were brought out. The timing mattered. The people responsible for the ceremony had to remember what should be done, who should participate, and how each part connected to the next. A mistake might be seen as more than carelessness. It could disturb relationships between people ancestors, animals, the land, or spiritual forces. This is why ceremonial knowledge was often treated with great seriousness. Songs carried memory. A song could belong to a family, a society, a healer, a community, or a particular event. It might be used only during one season or ceremony. Its words could preserve history. Its rhythm could guide movement. Its repetition could bring people into a shared state of attention. Drums, rattles, flutes, clappers, and voices created different sound worlds depending on the region and tradition. Music was not simply decoration. It could organize ceremony, strengthen community, and carry meaning that could not be separated from the event itself. Dance could do the same. It might represent animals, seasons, war, healing, gratitude, mourning, or social identity. The body became part of memory. A person learned not only what a ceremony meant, but how to move within it. Clothing, paint, feathers, masks, carvings, and ornaments could carry specific meanings. These objects were not interchangeable. A design used by one people might mean something entirely different to another. A feather could signify honor in one context and have no such meaning in another. A mask might belong to a restricted ceremony and not be an everyday object. To remove such objects from their cultural setting is to lose much of what made them important. Ceremonial spaces also differed. Some communities gathered in open plazas. Others used special houses, underground rooms, lodges, forest clearings, or locations far from the settlement. A space became sacred not only because of its construction, but because of what happened there and who had the right to enter. In some traditions, the direction a structure faced mattered. The movement of the sun mattered. The season mattered. The position of fire, doorway, participants, and ceremonial objects could all have meaning. People watched the sky carefully. The sun, moon, stars, and seasonal changes helped organize both practical and ceremonial life. The return of a constellation could signal that planting time was near. The length of daylight showed the movement of the year. The moon shaped nights, travel, tides, ceremony, and timekeeping. People did not need European instruments to understand these patterns. They observed them over generations. This knowledge could be built into architecture, stories, calendars, and ritual. Some settlements and earthworks were aligned with the movement of the sun or important directions. This does not mean every structure was an observatory, but it shows that the sky was part of how communities organized space and time. Ancestors remained important in many traditions. They were remembered through stories, names, burial places, objects, family ties, and ceremony. The dead were not always understood as completely absent. Their actions continued to shape the living. A family might inherit responsibility from them. A community might return to places connected with them. A leader might gain authority through ancestry. A child might receive a name carrying memory. The past remained close. It was not sealed away. Burial practices varied greatly. Some people were buried near settlements, others in mounds, caves, cemeteries, or places chosen for specific reasons. Bodies might be placed with objects clothing, food, or offerings. In other cases, burial was simpler. The treatment of the dead reflected beliefs about identity, status, family, and what came after death. It also reflected grief. People mourned parents, children, partners, friends, leaders, and relatives, just as people do everywhere. The ceremony gave grief a form. It told the living what to do when ordinary life had been broken. Healing often included spiritual as well as physical care. A healer might know plants, wounds, childbirth, fever, diet, massage, heat, or bone setting. That same person might also use song, prayer, smoke, fasting, dreams, or ceremony. These methods were not always seen as separate. Illness could be understood through the body, relationships, spirit, environment, or a combination of them. Some remedies were medically effective. Others depended on belief and ritual. Many practices remained poorly understood because outside observers recorded them incompletely or with prejudice. It is not always possible to reconstruct exactly what a ceremony meant to the people performing it. Where evidence is limited, certainty would be false. Dreams could carry importance. A dream might offer guidance, warning, healing, or a sense of connection. Some people sought dreams through fasting, isolation, prayer, or travel to particular places. But these practices differed widely and should not be treated as universal. The same is true of visions, guardian beings, sacred bundles, and ceremonial societies. They existed in some cultures, but not in one identical form across the continent. Animals often appeared in stories and ceremony. They were not simply resources. A bear, eagle, wolf, raven, bison, salmon, turtle, or other animal could carry cultural meaning depending on the people and place. This did not mean every animal was worshipped. The relationship was more complex. Animals could be teachers, relatives, helpers, dangers, food, symbols, or beings with their own power and agency. A hunter might treat an animal with respect because the hunt created an obligation. The animal sustained the community. Its body provided food, clothing, tools, and shelter. Using it carelessly could be seen as both wasteful and disrespectful. Respect for nature did not mean people never altered the environment. They burned land, hunted, farmed, built, redirected water, and harvested large quantities of food. But these actions were often governed by rules, memory, and responsibility. People understood that survival depended on continuing relationships with the places and beings around them. That relationship could fail. Overhunting, drought, conflict, flood, or poor decisions could still create scarcity. Spiritual beliefs did not remove practical danger. They gave people ways to understand and respond to it. Ceremony also supported political and social life. A large gathering could confirm leadership, renew alliances, redistribute food, welcome visitors, settle relationships, or display the strength of a community. Public ritual helped people see themselves as part of something larger than one household. Shared participation created unity. But ceremonies could also reveal rank and difference. Certain people might stand in special places, wear particular objects, or perform roles unavailable to others. spiritual authority could support political authority. In other cases, ceremonial specialists remained separate from leaders. Again, there was no single pattern. Knowledge could carry power. A person who remembered songs, medicines, family histories, seasonal signs, or sacred procedures held something valuable. This knowledge required discipline. It had to be learned correctly. Some people trained for years. They observed elders. They memorized long sequences. They learned when silence was required. They understood that not every story or practice should be shared with everyone. This is especially important today. Some indigenous traditions remain private and living. They are not relics of the distant past. They belong to communities that continue to decide how their knowledge should be protected, practiced, and passed on. As evening came, spiritual life did not always appear as a dramatic ceremony. Sometimes it was quiet. A person placed food near a fire. A family remembered someone who had died. An elder told a story connected to the season. A hunter prepared for the next day with care. Someone watched the moon rise above a familiar ridge. Children learned which places should not be entered carelessly. A song was repeated softly inside a house. The sacred was not always separate from the ordinary. It could be present in planting, cooking, mourning, travel, weather, memory, and rest. Across the continent, people lived within worlds filled with meaning. The rivers were routes, but also places of memory. The sky measured time, but also connected people to story. Animals provided food, but also carried relationships and responsibility. Homes sheltered the body, but also preserved ceremony and knowledge. To live in these communities was to belong not only to a family or village, but to a much larger network of land, history, obligation, and memory. As the sun moved lower across the sky, the pace of work began to change. Fields, rivers, forests, workshops, and paths gradually emptied. People returned carrying food, tools, firewood, water, hides, baskets, fish, or gathered plants. The final light of day touched wooden walls, earth lodges, stone rooms, bark-covered houses, and shelters built beside open grasslands. Across the continent, evening did not look the same, but everywhere, it marked the return from the wider landscape to the protected space of home. The fire became the center of the night. In some homes, it had burned throughout the day. In others, hot coals were uncovered and fed with dry fuel. A small flame grew slowly. Smoke rose toward an opening in the roof or moved through the entrance. The fire provided heat, light, and a place to cook. It also created the boundary between the familiar world inside and the darkness beyond the walls. Evening meals depended on the region and the season. Corn might simmer in a clay pot with beans, squash meat, or herbs. Fish could be roasted close to the fire. Dried food might be softened in water. Nuts and seeds could be ground and added to a meal. Preserved meat might be cut into small pieces and shared. Along the coast, shellfish or dried salmon could be brought from storage. In the Arctic, food collected during a successful hunt might sustain a household through long periods of cold. Nothing on the table appeared without earlier labor. Every meal carried the work of the people who had planted, gathered, hunted, carried, cleaned, dried, smoked, stored, ground, or cooked it. People often ate from shared containers. A household could include several generations. Children sat near parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, or other relatives. Guests might also be present. Food was distributed according to local custom, need, age, status, or responsibility. The arrangement differed from one community to another, but eating together strengthened the household. It reminded everyone that survival depended on cooperation. After the meal, the night's work continued. Tools were inspected. A broken handle could be replaced. A stone edge could be sharpened. Fishing nets were repaired. Baskets were finished. Hides were scraped or softened. Clothing was sewn by the light of the fire. A person might shape wood, polish bone, twist cord, or prepare materials for the next day. The work was quieter than the labor of daylight, but it was still essential. Many objects required long hours of patient attention. A tool that failed during a hunt could be dangerous. A poorly repaired roof could leak during rain. A damaged piece of clothing could become deadly in severe cold. Night was therefore a time to prepare for what morning might bring. Children watched and listened. Some were given small tasks. They carried fuel closer to the fire. They helped sort food. They held materials while an older relative worked. They cared for younger children. They learned through repetition. A skill practiced in childhood could one day become necessary for the survival of their own household. The fire also created time for stories. Not every story was told in every season. In some traditions, certain stories belonged to winter, when nights were long and outdoor work was reduced. Others were connected to ceremonies, families, places, or particular responsibilities. Stories could explain the history of a people. They could preserve the memory of migrations, floods, conflicts, alliances, animals, ancestors, or sacred events. They could teach children how to behave. A foolish character might ignore advice and suffer for it. A generous person might receive help. A careless hunter might fail. A proud leader might lose the trust of the community. The lesson was not always stated directly. Listeners were expected to remember and understand. Stories changed with the voice of the teller, but important details could remain stable across generations. An elder might repeat a story heard from another elder many decades earlier. A child hearing it beside the fire became the next link in a long chain of memory. In this way, history could survive without writing. Names, places, family relationships, journeys, and obligations were preserved through careful telling. The night was also filled with sound. In the eastern forests, insects, frogs, owls, and moving branches surrounded the settlement. Near rivers, water flowed in darkness. Along the coast, waves and wind continued through the night. On the plains, the open landscape carried distant sounds. Animals moved beyond the edge of the firelight. In the southwest, stone walls released the warmth of the day while the desert air cooled quickly. In the Arctic, wind pressed against the shelter as the world outside became dangerously cold. People understood these sounds. They knew which ones were ordinary. They recognized the movement of familiar animals. They heard changes in weather. A dog becoming restless could signal the approach of a stranger or animal. A sudden silence in the forest might bring attention. A change in wind could warn of a storm. Night did not make the landscape unknowable. It changed the way people read it. Some settlements kept watch after dark. This was especially important where conflict, raids, predators, or fire posed danger. A person might remain awake near an entrance or patrol the edge of the village. Dogs could help alert households. Fires had to be controlled. A spark reaching a dry roof could spread quickly. Someone had to make sure the flames remained useful without becoming destructive. In large settlements, night activity might continue in public spaces. Travelers could arrive late. Ceremonial gatherings might last after sunset. People preparing for a major event could continue working beside several fires. Voices, songs, drums, or movement might carry across plazas and between houses. But on ordinary nights, the settlement gradually became quieter. Sleeping arrangements depended on the home. People might rest on raised platforms, woven mats, hides, blankets, grass, or bedding made from local materials. Several family members often slept close together. This preserved warmth and made efficient use of space. In a longhouse, more than one household could share the same building. In an earth lodge, sleeping places were arranged around the walls. In a stone room, thick walls protected the interior from the falling temperature. In a northern winter home, every part of the enclosed space helped conserve heat. Privacy, as understood today, was often limited. People slept, worked, ate, and stored belongings within the same interior. The sounds of breathing, movement, children, animals, and fire became part of the night. Sleep itself was not always unbroken. Someone might wake to add fuel. A child might need care. A storm could disturb the household. Dogs might bark. A traveler could arrive. A sick relative might require attention. People rose and returned to sleep according to need. The night was not divided by clocks. Its progress was measured through the fire, the stars, the moon, animal sounds, temperature, and the first light before dawn. The sky offered guidance. Travelers used stars and familiar horizons. Hunters watched the moon. Seasonal changes in the night sky helped mark the year. A clear winter night looked different from a summer one. Certain stars appeared or disappeared at expected times. People learned these patterns as carefully as they learned rivers and trails. The sky was both practical and meaningful. It could guide movement, mark ceremony, and connect the present to traditional stories. Far from modern cities, the darkness was deep. There were no electric lights on the horizon. A small fire appeared bright against the night. The Milky Way stretched across the sky. The moon cast shadows over fields, rivers, rooftops, cliffs, and grasslands. A person stepping outside could see the shape of the entire landscape under starlight. The darkness could be beautiful. It could also be dangerous. Cold, animals' enemies, rough ground, and uncertain weather all remained beyond the shelter. This is why the home and fire mattered so deeply. They created security. Inside, people knew where tools were kept. They knew who was sleeping nearby. They knew the sounds of their own household. Outside lay the wider world. Inside lay warmth, memory, and belonging. Across North America, thousands of settlements entered the night in different ways. In one place, a family rested beneath a roof of bark. In another, people slept inside an earth-covered lodge. Along the coast, large wooden houses faced dark water. In the southwest, ladders were drawn up beside stone rooms. Farther north, a small interior remained warm while wind moved across the ice. Near the Mississippi, fires glowed among houses surrounding great public spaces. The details were different. The feeling was familiar. Work had ended for the day. Food had been shared. Tools were ready. Children were close. The fire burned low. The land beyond the walls became dark. And for a few hours, before morning returned, the household rested within a world built by generations of knowledge. By the late 15th century, North America was filled with communities that had already existed, changed, moved, traded, fought, built, and adapted for many generations. No one living there thought of the continent as a world waiting to begin. Its history was already old. Children were born into families with names, stories, responsibilities, and memories. Leaders negotiated with neighboring peoples. Farmers watched the weather. Hunters followed familiar routes. Travelers carried news across rivers and mountain paths. Ceremonies marked the seasons. Settlements grew, declined, moved, and were rebuilt. The world continued according to rhythms that had developed long before European ships crossed the Atlantic. In some regions, large towns stood near major rivers. In others, smaller communities were spread across forests, deserts, coasts, and grasslands. Some people lived in the same settlement throughout the year. Others moved with the seasons. Some societies depended heavily on farming. Others relied more on fishing, hunting, gathering, or a combination of many different sources of food. There was no single political system. Some communities were organized through councils. Some followed hereditary leaders. Some authority rested with clans, families, religious specialists, respected speakers, or successful diplomats. Power could be concentrated or widely shared. It could depend on birth wealth, generosity, skill, persuasion, ceremony, or military success. The differences between nations were as important as the similarities. Languages changed from one region to another. A traveler crossing the continent would encounter words, clothing, foods, homes, customs, and beliefs that might be completely unfamiliar. Even neighboring communities could have different traditions. Some were close allies. Others competed over land, trade, hunting territories, water, or political influence. Peace was never permanent. Neither was conflict. Relationships changed through marriage, negotiation, exchange, migration, and war. People understood that the world beyond their own settlement was complicated. They knew that strangers might arrive as visitors, traders, messengers, relatives, rivals, or enemies. news mattered. A change in leadership far away could affect a trade route. A drought could push families toward another region. A successful harvest could attract visitors. A growing settlement could become more powerful. A conflict could force people to abandon a familiar home. The continent was always changing. It was not frozen in one ancient moment. Communities adapted to new crops, technologies, alliances, environmental pressures, and ideas. They borrowed from one another without losing their own identities. A new style of pottery could spread across a region. A useful tool could be copied. A ceremonial practice could be adopted and changed. Seeds from another climate could be tested and gradually become part of local agriculture. People were capable of innovation. They did not simply repeat the past. They made decisions about what should continue and what should change. By this time, some societies had already experienced centuries of growth and decline. Cahokia had risen and become quieter long before Columbus reached the Caribbean. Other centers had gained influence. Some settlements had been abandoned because of drought, conflict, changing rivers, exhausted resources, or political pressure. Their people had moved elsewhere. Abandonment did not mean disappearance. Families carried language, skills, stories, seeds, ceremonial knowledge, and memories into new places. A village could vanish while its people continued. This is one reason the past can be misunderstood. Stone walls, earthworks, abandoned rooms, and old fields may appear silent today, but they belong to living communities. They were not created by mysterious, vanished races. They were built by the ancestors of indigenous peoples whose histories continued after Europeans arrived and continue into the present. The arrival of Columbus in the Caribbean in 1490 did not immediately transform every part of North America. Many communities remained unaware of the voyage. People living far inland continued with the familiar work of planting, fishing, hunting, trading, and raising families. There was no single moment when the entire continent suddenly changed. Contact unfolded unevenly. It began in different places at different times. Some coastal communities encountered Europeans earlier. Others did not meet them directly for generations. But even before direct contact, changes could travel ahead of the newcomers. Objects moved through trade. Stories spread from one community to another. Later, animals, diseases, weapons, and political disruptions would move across great distances. The effects were not immediate everywhere, but they became profound. The first encounters were not all alike. Some involved exchange. Some involved curiosity. Some involved misunderstanding. Some involved violence. Indigenous peoples did not respond in one unified way because they were not one people. Different nations made different choices according to their own interests, dangers, rivalries, and knowledge. Some tried to trade. Some resisted. Some formed alliances. Some used newcomers against existing enemies. Some moved away. Some attempted to control access to European goods. These decisions were made within political worlds that already existed. Europeans entered an inhabited continent with its own conflicts and alliances. They did not create politics there. They became part of them. Yet the newcomers brought forces that indigenous communities could not fully anticipate. Diseases from Europe, Africa, and Asia spread among populations with no previous exposure to them. In many places, epidemics caused devastating loss. Entire families died. Leaders, healers, farmers, craftspeople, and elders disappeared within a short time. When elders died, knowledge could be lost with them. When many adults died, fields could not be maintained. Children lost parents. Communities weakened. Political relationships changed. Survivors sometimes joined neighboring groups or formed new communities. The scale and timing of these epidemics differed by region, and historians cannot reconstruct every outbreak with certainty. But disease became one of the most destructive consequences of contact. Violence, forced removal, slavery, land seizure, and colonial expansion followed in different forms. Some nations resisted for centuries. Some negotiated treaties. Some adapted to new economies. Some rebuilt after enormous loss. The history that followed was not a simple story of indigenous disappearance. It was a history of survival, resistance, adaptation, and continuity. Native peoples remained. Their languages, governments, families, ceremonies, and traditions did not belong only to the world before Columbus. Many continue today. This matters because the phrase America before Columbus can create the impression of a world that ended completely. It did not. The political map changed. Populations suffered catastrophic losses. Communities were displaced. Many traditions were attacked or suppressed. But indigenous history continued through every century that followed. The people living today are not symbols of an ancient past. They are members of living nations and communities with their own modern histories. To imagine North America before European arrival is therefore not to imagine a vanished fantasy. It is to recognize a part of history that was often ignored, simplified, or deliberately erased. The continent was not empty. Its people were not without government, trade, agriculture, science, architecture, diplomacy, or historical memory. They did not all live the same way. They were not untouched by conflict or hardship. They were human societies in all their complexity. They built cities and small villages. They created trade networks. They managed forests and fields. They survived droughts, floods, harsh winters, political struggles, and migration. They loved their families. They mourned the dead. They taught children. They argued over power. They made art. They remembered the past. They planned for the future. On an evening near the end of the 15th century, long before news of European voyages reached most communities, ordinary life continued across the continent. Smoke rose above houses near the Mississippi. Families returned from fields in the Eastern Woodlands. Fish dried near rivers and coastal villages. In the Southwest, the last light touched stone and earthen walls. On the plains, people prepared food and repaired equipment beneath an open sky. In the far north, households gathered inside shelters, protected from wind and cold. No one in those places knew that, far across the ocean, events had begun that would eventually reach them. For that night, the familiar world remained. Children listened to stories, tools were set aside, meals were shared, fires burned low. The moon rose over rivers, forests, cliffs, coastlines, and grasslands. Thousands of communities rested beneath the same sky, each with its own language, history, and understanding of home. Their world was ancient, it was connected, it was changing, and it was already fully alive.